Friends, welcome back to the Collective's Conversations. We're having conversations at the intersection of faith and life. Today we've got Logan Ketterling. He's the pastor of influence at River Valley Network and a fellow podcaster at Talking Church. You're going to love this conversation as we just get into what influence means and even some ideation ideas and how you develop ideas and throw out the bad ones. So without any delay, let's get into our conversation with Logan. Hey friends, welcome back to the Collective's Conversations podcast. We're having conversations at the intersection of faith and life. I've got Logan Ketterling on the show. He's the pastor of influence of the River Valley Network, and we'll get into what that means. He's also, which is also part of the River Valley Church, he hosts the Talking Church podcast. You know our love for podcasts around here. And he's a self-proclaimed traveler. So let's do first things first, Logan. As a guy who travels a lot, where have been some of the most favorite places you've gone to?
Yeah, well, I always tell people it's the place I visited most recently because it has the most memory because I'm coming up on 40 countries. I've been to 39 countries and was just most recently in Singapore. And so that was a pretty incredible experience to be there. Very densely populated country, very small country, but still has lots of people and just a beautiful, beautiful place. I've always wanted to go. So that's where I was, the country I was at most recently, but I've been, midway through the year here, I've been on close to 50 or 60 flights already. And so I'm on the road all the time. I just, yesterday at the time of recording this podcast, I flew in and out of New York City in the same day. And so I try my best to be on the road with our network. Obviously, we're doing a lot of events and ministries that we support, podcasts that we're recording. And so I am on the road quite a bit, and I really do enjoy it, even though it can be tiring sometimes.
So let's talk 50 to 60 flights. Are you doing recordings there live somewhere, or are you just like the network's taking you to different events or venues?
Yeah, I would say mostly our network. Some of it's speaking at different churches, but we do 25, 26 events with our network every year, and most of them are out of state. And so we're traveling, all over. Our spring season's our busiest, so January to May is our busiest season. And then we have another busy season in the fall. Our summer, we do our conference at our church, so we're really trying to stick around in the area, getting all that prepped and ready. Also, it's just beautiful in Minnesota at that time of year, so we try to stay home as much as we can and travel as much during the winter. So yeah, we're doing those events and then trying to record some podcasts on the road. My hope is to do that more in the future as well. We're getting a travel rig set up to do it better. We've done some as we've traveled to different events, but I think that's something I'm hoping to do more of in the coming months and years.
Yeah. My ultimate dream, and I don't think I've ever shared this with anybody, is to have sort of a live podcast like recording with a studio audience, almost like one of those live events. I think Chad Veach has maybe done one. A couple other people have done. I think Andy Jeff Downs has done one, but like that would be like for me the pinnacle of this whole podcasting world and doing that. So I cheat
because I've done that several times, but it's been at our conference. And so they're already there, but I just say, hey, we're going to do a live podcast recording. So we have 1,000 people in the room and it feels awesome, but they didn't come for the podcast recording. They're there for the conference, but it's kind of stuck now. And so we're recording 2 or 3 of them at our conference in July. And so I'm excited to do that and have good guests. But again, I'm cheating. They didn't actually show up for my podcast.
Hey, it is what it is, right? The cheating or not, it's still true. So,
right.
You also mentioned you love to play golf. So I got to ask, you're doing all this traveling. Have you played like some of these unique golf courses somewhere while you traveled, or are you just playing there in Minnesota?
Oh no, we are playing when we travel everywhere we can. I've had the privilege to play so many nice courses, and most of the time people are just treating us, taking us there. We're not having to pay for it, which is just a huge blessing. But occasionally, my wife will say, "What was that?" I said, "Oh, I had to play. We were an hour away from this course I've always wanted to play." And so today I'm sporting some Muirfield that I got the chance to play when I was in Columbus. And so I love to golf. We'll never met a golf course that I didn't like. It could be a municipal course. I love playing it, or it could be a top 100 in the world or top 10, and I'm enjoying it either way. So we love it, my dad and I both. And whenever we travel, we absolutely bring our clubs.
That's awesome. Has there been a standout course you've played that you just absolutely like, this was bucket list kind of place that you played?
Yeah, there's a course in Upper Michigan called Crystal Downs that's about top 15 in the world, and it was very private. And a friend got us on there, and that was a fantastic course designed by Alistair McKinsey, who designed Augusta National and Cypress Point, who are some of the most famous courses. So that was a special treat, among others. But that one sticks out for sure as one that just was. I can't believe I'm playing this course.
Yeah. There's the course by us. I've never played it, and it's very exclusive. It's called the Honors Course. It's in Ottawa. They've hosted a couple like NCAA events and things like that, but it is like next to impossible to get into. Like, and you wouldn't know it's there. So like we drive through that little. It's about 15 minutes from where our community is, and you don't know. There's no indication that the golf course is there, other than like there's a back entrance for like trucks. And it's like set in there, like hidden, and it is like hyper exclusive. Like you have to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody to even get in. It's like I think it's part of. So we're here in Tennessee. The University of Tennessee football coach gets a membership, and like maybe 115 other people, and that's like it. But it's supposed to be exquisite.
Yeah, I've heard. I've had some friends who played it, and I've heard that it's incredible, and they're. I'm like, all right, next time you go, I need that invitation. But I've played more courses than I ever thought I would play, and so I'm not complaining at all. I get spoiled far too much, and so it's a privilege to get to do.
Yeah, so I enjoy the game. The game doesn't always enjoy me. I'm not as good as I'd like to be.
No.
So, do you got a favorite golfer? Let's just kind of stay here and just talk about this. Are you a Scotty Scheffler guy or?
Yeah, for sure. Scotty Scheffler guy, whether he's getting arrested or doing great in majors. I think he's awesome. I have some friends that know him, and they just say he's a fantastic guy, and it seems that way. Loves the Lord, and I'm not the guy that's like I have to like somebody is on the sporting team because they're a Christian, or like the athlete that's a Christian. But I do think it's awesome that he's at the highest level and living out his faith is a cool combination.
And that swing is so smooth, man. It's like
butter.
Like butter.
Yeah, it's
like
ridiculous.
Well, let's talk about what you do at River Valley. So River Valley Church is in Minnesota. You guys are a thriving church, and you have the River Valley Network. And you really hold this unique title called the Executive Pastor of Influence. It sounds a little bit like The Office, like one of those things, like you're an assistant to the regional manager.
Yeah, it kind of does.
Kind of unpack what that executive pastor influence really does and it entails for us.
Well, I actually just recently lost the executive name from my title, so now I'm just the pastor of influence. I got demoted, but we restructured our team and they changed the names. But so being the pastor of influence, when I tell people that, almost always they laugh. If I'm at a conference speaking or I'm at a church, I usually tell them, if I'm speaking on a weekend at a church, I say, just put pastor at River Valley Church. You don't need to put my title. It's just confusing. Yeah. But we have a department that's called Influence. And so the department I oversee is our pastors network, as you mentioned. We do a lot of the events I talked about, primarily in the area of generosity, helping churches grow in their what we call kingdom builders and above their tithe giving to missions. And then doing the podcast, I oversee our worship publishing and our book publishing. So really anything that's outside the church that's influencing other churches, influencing the body of Christ, that wouldn't be considered like normal local ministry or global mission. So it's kind of that third category of, we know we're influencing people, but they're not necessarily our church attenders. They're not necessarily missionaries or missions projects. And so pretty much everything else that doesn't have a spot ends up in influence. And so I do a lot with online, a lot with digital marketing. And so I love what I do. It's a great combination of business and ministry. I work really closely in Pastor Rob's office. He's also my dad, but works under my department as well. And so his team's on my team. So we work very closely together. I'm traveling with him quite a bit. And pretty much everything that he does runs through my office in some degree. And so it's a lot of different plates that are spinning all the time. It's definitely fun and exciting. It can be a bit overwhelming for some, but we manage ourselves well and have a great team underneath me that is supporting me and does a great job, again, influencing in what we feel that God has called us to do.
Which is super creative to kind of take that idea? Because I think every church and every organization has these things that are like, they don't fit this box or they don't fit that box. So who was kind of the brainchild or the thought ideation guy or girl who was like, hey, let's call this influence? Because influence is a buzzword in our culture right now. So where did that idea come from, that this is the department of influence?
Yeah, it grew naturally. So I mean, when we started the River Valley Network, and that was just the network department. And so then as it grew from there, then the person who took that over, his name was Caleb, he ended up kind of taking a few more things, again, that just weren't really fitting under portfolios as we did a leadership structure. So I think that's when the name Influence started. I've been leading it for 4 years. But really, I mean, it wasn't like influencer, like we're trying to make a name for ourselves. It was more just, again, that exact definition of like, we are impacting and influencing. Other people are copying what we do because we tell them they can. Other people are influenced by what we do. Some people just know us loosely, but they go, "Oh, I'm inspired by what you do," and we're open to all of that. You know, and when I say copy, I don't mean do everything exactly how we do it, but sometimes it's, hey, can we use that graphic? Can we use that video? Can we copy that style that you did and make it our own? And we're totally open-handed with that. We just want to help fuel the body of Christ. We're not going to, charge people for a graphic that we made. It's not our heart. We just want to say, hey, we want to fuel the church, and if it can be a resource and helpful to you, we've already made it. And so if it can help your church move forward. And so it's kind of morphed over time to just keep adding new departments that fit under that influence umbrella. And as we've grown as a team, we just keep getting things added to us. So I would just say it was natural. It wasn't like a strategic decision of like, we need to make an influence department. It's just we realized we were influencing in a lot of ways, and centralizing that as much as possible was the right decision. And, sometimes things leave our department, sometimes things get added, depending on the season that we're in.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I think, I can't remember who the quote is, but somebody said, creativity is a borrowed idea that you credit once, and then the second time you take credit for it. Right. And I think that's a lot of times in the kingdom of God. And I feel the way about a lot of things, ideas I have. I'm like, listen, I don't care if you take it, and I don't even care if I get credit for it, because if it's going to help the kingdom, then it's for the good. Now, if it doesn't help the kingdom, then don't give me credit at all. Like, so maybe let me ask that question. Has there been some bad ideas that have come out of the River Valley Network that you go, I wish we hadn't done that? Like, is there anything like you just like, man, we tried, but it wasn't any good?
Oh yeah. I mean, early on we had so many ideas. Like when you start a new role, I think you think that you know everything that your predecessor or the person that was doing the department didn't know. And I'm grateful that I got to stand, come in behind people who are really great thinkers and were willing to take risks and try new things. And so for me, I didn't have to come in and feel like I had to, try things just to try things, but it was coming out of COVID. And so the River Valley Network in general, I took it over in November of 2020. So, I mean, we had no live events, which was a core part of who we were. Our church resources kind of totally had to shift and change because the models were totally different. And so right away I thought, we're going to create these Facebook groups, and we're going to use them, and we're going to develop these cohorts, and we're going to have all sorts of people that are connecting with people around the country. And we created them, and nothing happened. Nobody was using them. People were, not engaged. Even our own staff wasn't engaged. Another thing that we did was early on, we did these things called master classes, which of course people are familiar with the brand Masterclass and how they make these videos and these long form things. And they were so well produced. We taught how we do church, and here's how we do youth ministry, and here's how we do worship ministry, and here's some things to consider as leading teams. And we filmed all these videos that were 7-8 episodes long, or 3 to 4 episodes long, and we released them in batches. And I mean, some of them got 2 to 3 views, some of them, and that was probably just us clicking and refreshing the page to make sure that it was working, and there was a few that got maybe a couple hundred, but it was so much time and energy editing, filming, developing content. And we just found that people were not watching them to the degree that of the energy that we put in. So that's actually what prompted the podcast to start. Is I just said, rather than filming this content in batches and doing all this work and all this editing, what if we just did a 1 camera shot and released it every week with us just talking about church. And so that's where the name Talking Church came from. And it was just started with that. Hey, what do we do for youth ministry? What questions do you get a lot of times from the network? And it just grew from there. And so those are some mistakes that I think we made early on, is just trying to do too much and not scale up. And thinking, I think churches can make that mistake. I think businesses can make that mistake, is just trying to, at least in Minnesota, there's a company in Canada called Tim Hortons. It's like a donut
coffee
place. Yeah, donuts and coffee. And really popular in Canada. We have a location in Vancouver, and they're just everywhere in Vancouver. And they came to Minneapolis and they launched big. They probably had 10, 12 different locations around the Twin Cities. And within 2 or 3 years, they were all closed because nobody knew what Tim Hortons was. And they kind of assumed Minnesota and Canadian culture are very similar, which is true. But nobody had any clue. There was no marketing. There was no push for it. They just launched them strong and just assumed because the cultures were similar and there was a lot of Canadians that maybe were living here that it would work. And it just totally didn't. And so I think a lot of times in church and in podcasting and in business, we just do that because we assume, since we know it and the market's right, that it's going to work out. And I've seen that we've made a lot of mistakes that way by sometimes going too big without testing the market or really asking our quote unquote customer what it is that they really need.
Yeah. Which is interesting. So you have all this backlog of these master classes you've created. Has there been a space for them after, like you launched Talking Church, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but now have you made those available to people to download or to get after the fact that maybe have become an audience since you started the podcast?
I would say we did a few, but most of them we just realized, this was right before COVID, right? So the way we did ministry was so different. And even just, logistically, you have staff that taught them that might not be on the team anymore. So it can be sometimes awkward. It's like, is that the right message? Even though we still love them. And again, we could do a whole podcast on that. We just did, actually. My dad and one of our former pastors talked about how they didn't get along and then they reconciled together. And it's been a really popular episode from that. But I think the content too, just here's how we do youth ministry is different. Here's how we do kids ministry is different 3-4 years from now. It's different 3-4 months from when you record it. And so we haven't really utilized it. There's a couple that we did release on YouTube that were a little bit more evergreen style leadership things from Pastor Rob and a few others. But by and large, we just shifted strategies and just said, hey, that was a lot of work, a lot of time. Maybe that lesson, although costly, is what led us to start the podcast, which is what did. And obviously have seen that grow from there. And so sometimes it is those mistakes you make that lead you to the right decision. And you just have to be grateful and fail fast and move on and just not kick yourself too hard, because at least you were trying something.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've often told the story here on the Collective's Conversation how I got into podcasting. I had a previous podcast called The Leadership Drip with my friend Rob Foltz. We were talking about young adults and the local church, kind of how to reach young adults. And we sat down one day to write a book. We were like, we're going to write a book about this. And so we made an outline to a book, and we had all the questions and none of the answers. And I was like, Rob, we don't have any answers, man. And I said, what we need to do is talk to people who have answers. And so out of that, we're like, we should probably record those conversations. And what began as an idea to write a book became podcasting. And so we almost got into podcasting accidentally, which became, we did 100 plus episodes and talked to great leaders and different people about young adults. And it was always, the conversation was kind of always shifting, but it centered around those two questions. So it sounds like Talking Church was almost the same kind of situation. You got into it almost by accident. Like you failed with the master classes. And then you're like, hey, what if we just every week talk to leaders and leadership about this? Was it almost like bumping into it on accident?
Yeah, I think in some ways. It was my third podcast. My first two podcasts failed. The first one failed after 3 episodes because I just quit doing it because I didn't want to keep going because I didn't have the time, and it was a young adults podcast like yourself. And then the second one I called like 10 minutes in quarantine or 7 minutes in quarantine. I can't remember, during COVID. And I reached out to people because we were all in our houses, and I just did this like 7 to 10 minute conversation with people all around the world. And it actually was a really cool concept, but I just didn't have an audience at that point. And so I filmed some great episodes, but just didn't get a ton of traction. It was for our young adults. And then I ended up stopping that because, COVID slowed down and things ramped back up. And so, yeah, I think for this one, it was more of a logistical thing. I don't want to spend all that time to develop these master classes and then have nothing, versus if we just film it and release it that week, it's not that much time, and the relevancy, we can answer topics that are people are talking about today. I think people have shifted that in the podcasting world, is like some people would record things, a year or two in advance and then release them. In today's culture, you can't really do that,
right,
because of the relevancy. It has to be released. It can be a couple months, but I think if it gets to the point where you're talking a year later, well, that conversation might not even meet the needs of who you're trying to talk to at that point. Yeah. And so that was really my goal, was the relevancy, and then the logistical work behind the scenes. We had lost some staff, that were in that area, and just trying to do things in kind of the minimum viable product. Now we have a full studio, and our new podcast studio is wrapping up here in the next few weeks, which is super exciting. But that's multi-purpose, multi-use. It's really changed our frame of reference for what podcasting can do. I now lead another podcast for our church that is called Processing, that is launching, kind of relaunching with one of our executive pastors, that we answer questions from the congregation. And so, I think that it kind of was an accident. It was, the way I describe it is, there was multiple waves. I haven't studied this. It's not like first wave, second wave, third wave, of feminism and of podcasting. But I would say I was early in the COVID wave of podcasting. So there's been a brand new emergence of podcasting post COVID, and
right,
and a lot of people are down and negative on it. And I actually say if you meet somebody that doesn't have an Instagram account, and then you say, "Oh, I just got an Instagram account," you're like, "Oh, that's crazy. You were really late in getting it." But they still have an Instagram account, and you'll follow them, and you'll interact with their content. Right. Podcasting is a little bit different because it's long form, but it's the barrier to entry is so low that I think a lot of people have a lot of great things to say, and I just think that most people are not willing to stick with it. I think on the other side, people make fun of podcasters because they think they have something to say and they actually don't. And I think you obviously jokingly discovered that in your book. We need to find other people, but there's no shortage of great conversations, but there's also never too many great conversations. If you're just on the podcast to get clout and to make make a name for yourself, and you really haven't added value to people's lives, and you're only doing it for selfish reasons, people are going to feel that. But if you're really trying to serve a community that you're in, even if it's niche, 40, 50 people that are listening, well, if you enjoy it, if it doesn't take a ton of your time away from the things that you love, and the people that are listening get value out of it, there's nothing wrong with it. You're not flying across the country and spending tens of thousands of dollars. You got $100 microphone and plugged into your computer, and you're having conversations with people that you love. There's nothing wrong with that.
I feel like COVID, there was two things everybody did in COVID, right? They started day trading on Robinhood, and then they started a podcast. I feel like everybody I know is I'm going to be a day trader on Robinhood, and they were buying
never have to work again,
right? Yeah, and they were buying crypto and whatever else, and then they all started podcasts. And about 6 weeks in, I think everybody quit podcasting. I think I saw a statistic that the average podcaster, and this was 2020, 2021, made it maybe 8 episodes, and most of them quit after 8 episodes.
That's probably where I was with the second podcast, the quarantine one. I think I was probably 8 episodes. I'm one of those stats.
Yeah, and I feel like I was almost an early adopter because I think we started the Leadership Drip was started in 2019. It was pre-COVID we were doing it. And I remember COVID showing up. We had 3 interviews set up and we were doing all by Zoom, but we were at the time we were recording on the campus of the university. And we had 3 interviews set up. COVID showed up and shut everything down. And we were using the university studio at the time, and we scrambled and had to buy gear, and we went remote on it, again, for a couple $100, and it didn't really change the value of the content. We just had to repurpose it or redo how we were recording it. So I think everybody had a podcast, but the endurance of it, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. If you can just keep serving your audience over and over and over, they'll keep showing up. It's about really just enduring. And so what was with Talking Church, you kind of mentioned it, that you wanted to serve this community that you felt like the masterclass videos didn't. What was sort of the heart behind it starting? Was it just to continue serving the network you guys had? Hey, let's get these conversations to the people we're serving. Hey, let's get some value to them. Let's help equip them.
Yeah, the whole network's purpose is to train healthy and generous churches. And so we want church to be healthy, we want church to be generous. Now, generosity, we think is embodied in a lot of things. Obviously, it's a posture of how we care for the entire body of Christ, how we care for our congregation, where we put our money, where we send our money, that we don't keep it for ourselves. But then from a health standpoint, I think health is something that is very difficult to teach, but a lot of people, when they come to River Valley, they say, that's so interesting. You guys are growing and you're a very large church. We now have 13 physical locations, and people wonder, how is it that you're able to remain healthy? And my parents have done a great job at saying, we maybe could be a bigger church, have more people coming on a weekend, but we maybe would have burned more staff along the way and hurt people. And so they really do their best. And again, we're not perfect at it, but I do think many people, when they come visit, they go, there's something about this culture that just feels so healthy. And so trying to help other churches that want to replicate that want to learn from the mistakes that we've had. The reason that my dad emphasized that so much is because the first several churches he worked at were some of the most toxic environments that you'd ever imagine. I mean, like some of these churches, literally, they hated each other on staff. Some of the churches had people that would cuss each other out in the staff meetings. Like, this is not a healthy culture. It wasn't my dad that was participating in that, but he observed that and thought, if this is what ministry is like, man, these people were right. Ministry is hard. And when he started the church, he said, I don't want to make it like those churches that hated each other. I don't want our staff to be people that are a revolving door that when you leave, you say, I never want to talk to you again. You're horrible. Almost every one of our staff who's a former staff member, we have amazing relationship with. When they come back in town, they visit us. It doesn't mean that it wasn't difficult when they left or that there wasn't a problem when they were here, but I just think our posture has always been, we're not God. God told us to forgive. God told us to move forward. And if we've had a difficult situation with any of our staff or anyone who leaves our church, we want to be open-handed with that. And so that really has been our heart for the podcast. It's been our heart for what the network is we want to help churches in the area of generosity, and we want to help churches be healthy and pastors be healthy. And so any topic that relates to that, which is quite a few, we try to have, and then occasionally we'll have just amazing, fun guests that are speaking at the church that we sit down with and have in-depth conversations around topics that are maybe their focus or area of ministry is in. But that's really the heart of the network and the heart of the podcast.
Yeah, and our mutual friend Terry Parkman speaks very highly of River Valley Church and River Valley Network. I asked him, I had him on the show some time ago, and I was like, are you ever going to leave Minnesota? And he's like, no, I love it here. And I was like, even the winters? Like, as a guy who lived in Chicago and left the snow, like, I don't love the winter anymore. Like, winter in Tennessee is a whole lot different than winter in Chicago or Minnesota. But Logan, you're kind of a young leader in this thing, and really we look at media. Podcasting is one form of it, but social media is another form where we see a lot of young leaders stepping into, and again, having influence and trying to have influence. How do you personally kind of guard or use guardrails or put up guardrails on doing things for chasing clout and doing things out of really a kingdom heart?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and this one that I continue to wrestle with every single day. Honestly, I really believe I could have a much larger social media following if I chased the clout, but of course, that wouldn't be the thing that I felt God wanted me to do. But I also want to be clear that doesn't mean people who do have a large social media following are chasing clout. I think sometimes we can, bring things together that are mutually exclusive, but in order for our brain to process them better in our own decision making, we join them together and we say, oh, those who have a lot of social media followers must be chasing clout, because we feel a conviction about not chasing clout and try to explain that's why we don't have a lot of social media followers. And I just think that those things are exclusive to each other. Now, absolutely, again, we have to be warned about this. I think Scripture is clear that we were not made. God didn't make us to be worshipped. We must deflect our praise to Him. And when people worship us, that's why we see celebrities that end up in such toxic environments. I have friends who people would maybe know their names and know who they are because they're famous in the world, but they struggle at a degree that many people don't realize. And I've seen that in a very small degree with our church and with my parents, and walking around in the Minnesota area, we're recognized quite a bit because of the nature of the ministry that we do. And again, it's such a small degree. And then I think about those who are even more well known to 10 times or 100 times, how much that must weigh heavily on them. And so again, I handle that with open hands, but I try to think, what is God asking me to say? What is God asking me to do? I think if it's worth saying in person, it's worth saying on social media. I think we may have to communicate it a little bit differently because you don't have the context of being in the room with somebody. I think if we're clipping something out, we have to be intentional and careful about it, knowing that the full context isn't there. But I also don't think that should limit us. So I know I'm being kind of a little bit political in my answer about it, but I do think that we have to weigh this significantly, knowing that social media is where people live. I was off social media for 2 years. I kind of was very against it. Right after 2020, I managed a lot of our social accounts at the church during 2020. And of course, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And so, I mean, the vitriol and the anger and just the hurt and the pain that happened, throughout COVID, throughout the election, throughout, everything surrounding George Floyd's death and everything, that made me just hate social media. So I deleted it for 2 years. So for 2021 and 2022, I literally was off social media that whole time. And I kind of felt like I was holier than thou. Like I was better than all these people who are on social media. I felt convicted that was what I should do, but I started projecting my own conviction onto everybody else and feeling like they should do it too. And I remember after feeling just convicted about that I was kind of starting to become not, I don't know the right word, but judgmental is probably the right word, of people who are choosing that path. I felt God say, like, get over yourself. Just if this is a tool that you want to use it for my glory and use it to point people to me. But if it's a tool that you don't want to use, but I felt like, no, I'm the pastor of influence. I do think it's probably the right thing to do, that I oversee all these platforms. I don't even have it myself. And so I felt like it was the right thing. And God has just shown me that there's a balance. There's definitely spending too much time on it. There's definitely clout chasing, but we've reached, I think, 6-7 million people just with our podcast account, over the last year and a half. And so that's really cool to realize that people are being influenced by social media and by Instagram. Just that's just Instagram alone. And so I've had to realize that it's a tool. Not everyone's able to do it, but I think all of us can prayerfully consider what God's asking us to do. I know it was a long answer, but that's a little bit of my journey. No, that's a great
answer. And I want to ask a little bit about the 2 years off. You referenced it, and you said you kind of got judgmental on people being on it, but did you notice some mental, emotional, even spiritual health things in that season of being off social media? Because it's a trap, man. It's addictive. It's all the things. Oh, yeah. So tell us about maybe in that 2 years, some of the benefits you saw. And we'll clip this and put it on Instagram, clearly, because we're going to talk about Instagram. But what were some of the benefits of not being on Instagram?
So let me go. I posted something early on when I got back. I'm trying to see if I can find it, because it was like 24 things I learned from being off social media for 24 months. And so I'm trying to pull up that, because it's something that I thought was really helpful for me and these lessons that I learned. But now I can't seem to find it. And so, of course, social media is being the bane of my existence on this. Let's see. Sorry, friends. We're going to clip this out, and then it's just going to be a long pause of everything.
Pause.
I can't seem to find it. But at any rate, I think that God was doing a lot in me, and I think there was a lot of healing that took place. I think that I needed that. And so I don't say that to feel that it was the wrong thing. I think people who, I didn't tell people, hey, I'm deleting my social media. A lot of people feel the need to do that.
Yeah.
I think
like they announce it. Like, I'm doing a social media fast by announcing it on social media.
Totally. Exactly. And I think that, again, it's understandable, but I think that it's a little bit self-serving. And I don't want to be overly critical of those people, because I know there are some people that, that people really do desire that content and rely on it. But I think for the most part, God was just trying to teach me a lesson about myself. And so me being off social media was I had to pay attention to things that in friends in my life. I had to be more attentive. I found out about, engagements, marriages. I mean, there were people in that 2 years that met their spouse, got engaged with their spouse, got married to their spouse. Some of them like even getting pregnant. And I literally had no clue about any of it. And then I see them in person and it's like, hey, this is my wife and she's pregnant. And oh my goodness. Well, it kind of was a little bit of a cool experience to say, well, that was cool to get to hear an update from you and actually have to ask you questions about your life. But then on the other side, you go, but you missed all those moments that you could have engaged with them and texted them. And so again, I think it's like, can it be good? Yeah. Can it be bad? Absolutely. But just a lot of lessons along the way that I had to learn.
I feel like a stalker sometimes. It's weird. Like I'll show up and I have friends. No, and like I've seen pictures of their kids, and I'm like, "Hey, Jimmy, how are you? How was the baseball game?" And Jimmy has no idea who I am because like he doesn't follow me on social media, but I'm tracking with his parents. Like it feels like this weird kind of I know their story, but in real life we don't know each other kind of thing sometimes. So did you find those conversations to be not maybe more meaningful, but more rich, maybe the word, when you sat down with people that you hadn't tracked with and seen their whole life in pictures?
Absolutely. It was incredibly rich, but I also think it was in the culture that we're in, it was confusing because it was super rich, but they didn't reciprocate it in the sense of they're like, well, you didn't know that. And so there was a little bit of a oddness to it, but I would say overall it was a positive experience. I ended up finding the list, if you're all right if I share it.
Yeah, let's go for it.
It was the thumbnail was a picture of me and my wife, so it was harder to find because I was looking for like a real thumbnail. But so 24 lessons I learned being off social media for 24 months. 1, I survived. Number 2, a follow does not equal friendship. Number 3, it's good not to know everything. 4, finding out news in person is more fun, just like we talked about. I got back hours per day. There are other ways to get in touch with people. I ended up texting people all the time and just, hey, what's going on in your life? Tell me something. And just my true friends. Number 7, my friends didn't actually change. 8, I felt more secure. Number 9, the phone dials. The phone dials. You can call. It's crazy. Number 10, sometimes it's best not to say what I'm thinking. 11, I valued those in-person conversations more. Number 12, in 2 years, this is crazy. In 2 years, only one person asked why I don't post on Instagram anymore. And it was 1 week before I came back on social media. So for 23 months and 3 weeks, nobody asked me one question about me not being on social media, which is so interesting. And so you think about it like, oh, nobody cares and I'm not missed. That's not the message. The message is there's enough content out there to fill whatever hole you leave. And I actually think that could be a lesson for people to stay on social media because the content, the hole will be filled. But wouldn't it rather be the content that's life-giving, inspiring, life-changing, rather than be whatever is going to fill that hole? And so those were all like the positive things. And then the kind of the things that I missed was 13. I said I miss my friends who don't live close. People, I've talked about travel all over the world. I had the best 2 years. I wish I took more pictures. I wasn't taking a lot of pictures because I wasn't posting them. And I wish I would have taken more pictures. I missed some big news. I miss sending encouraging DMs to people, responding to things. I miss connecting about, sports teams and just little things like that. I felt out of the loop. It made my career more challenging, being the pastor of influence, meeting people at conferences. Hey, what's your Instagram? Would love to connect. You don't really always give people your phone numbers, but you'd love to connect on social media. And so every time I'd say, I'm off social media, and it was kind of a holier than thou thing, or I had to, get over myself. Explaining it felt self-serving. 21, our personal brand is something we all have to steward. And so trying to figure out, okay, I have this podcast that I'm starting. I have to steward this that God's given me. I felt like less of a contributor. I miss promoting other people's things and other things I love. Like when someone comes out with an album or somebody comes out with a book, I love promoting it, telling other people about it. So I miss doing that. And number 24, I'm ready to reconnect and get engaged. So again, I posted that in the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And I think all those things remain true. I take time sometimes where I just am on it less, or when I'm on vacation, maybe delete it or give my wife my phone for the trip as much as I can.
Yeah. Um, Darren Whitehead, I don't know if you're familiar with Darren. He's down in Franklin, Church of the City in Franklin. He just released a book, and I think his church does it where they do a technology fast, and like he outlines this whole thing. And I forget, I think it may be 40 days, but I know I could probably use it. And again, when you're hosting a podcast and you're kind of putting it out on social media as your promotionals, it's kind of hard to disconnect from it. But I think we all could probably do a little bit more disconnecting and trying to connect in real life. And so I appreciate you sharing sort of those thoughts from your time off of social media. So one of the things you do as the pastor of influence is kind of help cultivate and tell stories. How important is it that we tell good stories in the church and become good storytellers as the church?
Well, if we want to be like Jesus, we tell stories. And so,
just right to the point, Logan. Like, just cut right to the chase.
I mean, he was great. He was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, storyteller ever. I mean, I think if he tried even harder, if he wanted to be, he could have told longer stories. But I think we can learn a lesson from him that sometimes it's the short stories that are worth sharing. And so, even in the midst of long form podcasts like this one and what I oversee, we've seen those short clips go viral and impact people. Mm-hmm. I think everyone wants a good story. I mean, you're watching a sports game, and what do they talk about? Yeah, they talk about the stats, they talk about things, but they talk about what they've overcome in their life. They talk about the against all odds, what they've defeated, or David versus Goliath type stories in sporting events, or people who are great actors who were addicts and who were on the homeless maybe because of their addiction, and they came back from it. Everyone loves those, and the reason why we love those is because it's the heart of God. It's the nature of the gospel. Is the greatest comeback story ever, is that we were coming back from death and sin, and Jesus saved us from that. And so I think that stories are I mean, the Bible is a story. The whole Bible is a story together. Right. Jesus' life is a story. The parables are stories. There is nothing more like the heart of God than the stories of what he's done in us. We read about it in Revelation, say by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. The word of our testimony isn't the testimony of the bad things that we've done. It's the testimony of God's saving testimony, and then how it then applies to our life. And so I hope I've explained it clearly enough that it's the core part of the message of the gospel, and it's the core part of our life, is all of these little stories that make up the greater story, which is ultimately God's story.
Yeah, and I think at the core of who we are, we're all storytellers. Like, I remember sitting around the table when I was a kid and listening to my uncles tell stories. I think maybe that is one of the reasons I love doing what I do here on the podcast, and probably one of the reasons you love it as well, because it feels somewhat like I'm in my grandmother's house again, telling stories and listening to stories and having conversations. And so I think this heart of who we are all storytellers. We all want to tell our story or somebody else's story, and I think it's before I went into ministry, I was going to be a broadcast journalism major. I was going to be the next Cubs broadcaster. It's a long story gone short. But I remember in the communication theories class, like the only thing I remember from that class is the primary learning style of all human beings is by story. And I think we all have to be storytellers, and the church has to be a storyteller, because it's how we grow, it's how we learn. Like, stories stick. Like, statistics are one thing, like you talked about athletes, but nobody cares who hit 305. We want to know the story of how they got there, or it's why movies like Rocky are so valuable. It's the storyline. How do you think?
Well, and what stories? Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt, but what stories are the ones we tell? They're the stories of the moments that were unexpected, or right, the moments of what we used to be. You don't hear people saying, "Oh yeah, let me tell you the story of when I bought my super expensive car and everything went according to plan." We tell the story of when we used to drive that beater that you didn't think was going to make it to work, and that the thing was scraping on the ground, and the gas was leaking, but you loved it because you got it for $10 and you had no money and didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And those are the stories that you share. Why? Because they're relatable, because not everyone can experience the top, but everyone has had moments down low. And I used to have a brand. I was in the fashion industry before I went into ministry, and the tagline of our company was "Wear the Story," and everything we did was all about story. We've made these story films. We told people where the materials came from, the people that helped make those materials happen, and the story of the region and city it was in. And I loved doing that. And so, yeah, I think the same is true with podcasting. And everyone has an incredible story to tell. The challenge is not everybody is good at pulling that story out of people. Some people squash it. Some people interrupt you like I just did. And they jump in and they don't know how to lead a story, right? They don't know how to go from the next and ask the right question. They just move on, or they aren't willing to be curious and dig deep. And so the best podcast hosts, the best storytellers are those who have this natural curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I think for some, they're amazing at just being an orator and telling a story just for themselves. But I think most can sit down in an environment like this and when asked the right questions, can share a beautiful story that maybe they wouldn't have been able to do with a speech or a sermon.
And I think we all have a story to tell. Like,
right.
And this, what you and I talk about, like with Talking Church and with the podcasting and with everything, I think everybody has a story because they've had something they've walked through, something they've overcome, something they've endured. And if they're a believer, something God has saved them from and saved them into in this life of Christ. So I think stories are a critical component, and I appreciate what Talking Church is doing, telling stories, and what you're doing. Let's wrap it up because I know we both got things to do, and I'm going to honor your time. But it is called The Collective's Conversations. So who is one person, historical, present, fictional, or in your real life that you'd want to sit down and have a conversation with?
Yeah, it's a broad, tough question. I think I'll put a caveat. Obviously, Jesus would be the answer, and then there's too many biblical characters that I would debate between. So I'm going to just put that on the side for a second, acknowledging that would be the first. But I think that C.S. Lewis would be interesting to me. I love his books. I love how he managed to write some of the most deep theological works, but also write the Chronicles of Narnia that are just epic fairy tale stories that obviously have some Christian themes in them. But I think he's just a master, and I feel like sitting down with him for dinner, he'd probably be smoking a cigar and in a pub somewhere in England. But I think it'd be awesome to just sit down with him and hear how he can manage those two things, or sit down with him and J.R.R. Tolkien as they were arguing with each other about atheism and Christianity early on. That would be really interesting to me.
Yeah, this is the second guest, I think, who's referenced Lewis and Tolkien. I had a guest a couple weeks ago. Yeah, and I told that guest, her name was Callie Logan, about a book I started. I'm really good at starting books and not finishing them. And I think it was called the Wardrobe, the Hobbit, and the Great War or something. And it's about Lewis and Tolkien and their conversations about faith and life during the World War II. I'm going on a vacation very soon. I should probably take that book and finish it. But I think Lewis would be a great conversation. Awesome. And Logan, I'm going to have to caveat my question and say, who is one person besides Jesus you don't have a conversation with? Because I think everybody answers, well, Jesus is the obvious question, or obvious answer to the question. So
yeah, but I get to talk to him every day. So.
Yeah. So, well, Logan, man, thanks for coming on. Thanks for being a great guest, and thanks for all you're doing with the River Valley Network. Where can our friends maybe connect with you on? Are you on Instagram? Is that the best place?
Yeah, just Logan Ketterling on Instagram, or the Instagram account Talking Church is where the podcast is. Would love to help in any way if any pastors are there. And rivervalleynetwork.org is the website for all the things that are going on in our ministry. And just appreciate conversations like this. Appreciate you having me on, Jeff. And until next time or next conversation, I'm excited to read your book once you get done with vacation.
Yeah. And as we always say here at the Collective's Conversation, you guys see the table. Thanks for coming on, Logan. Wow, what a great conversation that was. Thanks for joining us in the conversation. If something from the conversation really stood out to you, would you share it and tag me on social media at Jeff_Pitts_ on Instagram? And we would love it if you would rate and review and subscribe to the show. That just helps us reach more people with these great conversations. And as we always say, you've got to see the table. Thanks for joining the conversation.